This painting by William Turner was recognized as the greatest British painting of all time. His face is on Britain's 20-pound banknote. Today, I will tell you the incredible story of a great miser who led a double life, hid his paintings from the world, and the world gasped when they saw them. Hello, everyone. I'm Nina Chef, and today it's the great and terrible Turner, perhaps Britain's greatest artist. Pour yourself some strong English tea. It's going to be very interesting. Let's get started. William Turner was born in the very heart of London, in the Covent Garden area, right above his father's barber shop on April 23, 1775. At the end of the 18th century, Covent Garden was nothing like the well-kept, touristy, and prestigious shopping and theatre district we know today. It was an incredibly colorful, noisy, dirty, and in its own way dangerous place. The main artery of the area was the huge Covent Garden wholesale market, where vegetables, fruits, flowers, and herbs were sold. From early morning, the streets were filled with hundreds of carts, the rumble of wheels, the shouts of vendors, and piles of rotting garbage. There was a pungent, heavy smell of earth, rotting greens, horse manure, and fish here. Little Turner grew up in the midst of this endless hive of human chaos, which gave him phenomenal tenacity. He grew up to be a pragmatic, tough city guy who wasn't afraid of dirt, hard work, and was pretty good at elbowing his way past competitors. And this, as you will soon see, will become an important reason for his success. The artist's father, William Turner Sr., ran a barber shop here and sold wigs. His mother, Merrill Marshall, came from a family of London butchers. Turner spoke with a Cockney accent all his life, a specific London dialect from the working class neighborhoods. And he deliberately never got rid of it, even though he would move in the highest circles. This would become his form of rebellion. Besides, Cockney would help him hide behind a fictional persona when he became fabulously wealthy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. At the age of 11, the boy was transferred to a school in Margate, a seaside town in the northeast of Kent. It was there, looking at the North Sea, that Turner made his first serious drawings. His father, who was also an artist and a shrewd businessman, saw an opportunity in them and, upon returning to London, began displaying them in the window of his barber shop and selling them to customers for a few shillings each. His father boasted, "My son will become a painter," and he turned out to be absolutely right. A brief traditional digression so you can understand what England was like in the last decades of the 18th century. This was the era of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. London was growing, the first factories were belching smoke, and canals were being built. But at the same time, it was also the era of wars with revolutionary France. Britain was at war with Napoleon almost continuously from 1793 to 1815. The country needs images of its greatness, its navy, its nature, its history. You see, the situation is very similar to the one Ivazovsky will find himself in 40 years later. If you haven't seen my video about him, check it out. It's really interesting. The Royal Academy of Arts, founded just 20 years ago, was the most conservative, closed, and influential institution in the country. It was headed by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Getting in off the street was almost impossible. It's like getting a full scholarship to Oxford today. But that's exactly the incredible thing that will happen to Turner. Turner's father, seeing the boy's talent, understood that he could be the family's ticket out of poverty. But it was absolutely impossible to get a nobody directly into the academy. Recommendations were needed. So, in order to get those recommendations and at the same time prepare the boy for the academy, his father sends him to apprentice with the architects Thomas Moulton and Thomas Hardwick. His task was to tint architectural drawings with watercolor. And he was so good at it that at the end of 1789, Thomas Hardwick, a very famous architect in London, personally recommended the 14-year-old boy to the committee of the Royal Academy. Watercolors and topographical sketches by Turner were attached to the recommendation. However, at the academy, you couldn't just show up and study on a recommendation. He had to pass a drawing competition using antique casts. And although students were usually admitted to the academy from the age of 15, age didn't matter much. The main criterion was a steady hand. Turner was admitted as a probationer and given access to the academy's inner sanctum, the halls filled with plaster casts of famous antique sculptures. His task was to choose one of the statues assigned by the council and make an exact monumental drawing of it in pencil or chalk, proving to the admissions committee that he could work with form, light, and shadow using classical examples. He was given a week for the test. Turner chose the cast of Apollo Belvedere. the standard of male anatomy and classical proportions. When the Academy Council, headed by Joshua Reynolds, evaluated the final drawing of Apollo Belvedere, that drawing has miraculously survived. They saw a work that was radically different from the drawings of ordinary teenagers. The years spent running errands for architects produced excellent results. Turner's hand did not tremble. The lines were smooth and the shadows were amazingly precise. He showed a maturity of touch that even some 20-year-olds lacked. On December 11, 1789, at a council meeting, it was officially announced the candidate William Turner was admitted as student number 241. He was given a permanent student ID, which granted him access to free lectures, the library, and most importantly, to the annual exhibitions that would soon change his life. Let me tell you how the Academy operated in those days. It's very interesting. At that time, classicism reigned, which meant that one had to study and follow very strict rules of the style that had been established over 100 years earlier by Nicolas Poussin, and which would remain unshakable for almost another 100 years, until Impressionism would break them. According to classicism, the only true art was considered to be epic, battle, mythological, and religious paintings. In general, they had to be filled with people in the right scenes and proportions, with proper shadows, a clear horizon, and a precise composition. Portraits, landscapes, and especially still lifes were considered secondary styles of painting. That's why learning to paint people was considered the most important thing. The education was free, and the Academy was not funded by the state, but by selling paintings at the annual exhibition, where admission cost 1 shilling to keep out the common rabble. The best students were awarded gold and silver medals, and the winner of the main prize received a grant for a trip to Rome to study the great masters. The training lasted as long as 10 years and was divided into 3 stages. The first was copying old engravings until your hands were sore. The second was endless copying of those very plaster casts of sculptures so that the student could practice on completely motionless objects. Then there was an exam, after which the student could be allowed to work with real male and female models. But the female models posed nude, so there was a strict safety rule. Only students over 20 years old or those who were already officially married were allowed to draw female nudes. That's why most students practiced on male models, hoping that one day they would be allowed to draw the most coveted subject, not only in the artistic sense, the female body. Women weren't allowed into painting at all back then. In the evenings at the Academy, Turner copied engravings and plaster casts, and during the day, when the students were left to themselves, he practiced drawing from another model, the only one available to him for free, nature. Just a year after enrolling, at the age of 15, his watercolor was accepted for the Academy's annual summer exhibition for the first time. For a first-year student, this was an incredible success. At the same time, he continued working with architects and also started making engravings for the publication's copper sheet and pocket journal, honing his skills in perspective. During these years, he made an important acquaintance, Dr. Thomas Monroe, the chief physician of Bedlam, the famous psychiatric hospital where the artist's mother was staying. Yes, that's right. The word Bedlam actually comes from the name of this hospital. A passionate collector and art enthusiast, he hired Turner to copy the watercolors of John Robert Cozens. Cozens was actually in Bedlam at the time and entrusted Monroe with most of his works for safekeeping. And it was from Cozens's watercolors that Turner first got the initial spark of his main idea, that natural phenomena need not be confined by pencil lines, but can be rendered with watercolor alone. At the age of 18 at the Academy's summer exhibition, he presented his first oil painting, in which he experimented with depicting a powerful climatic effect called approaching squall, hot wells. There is an amazing detective story connected with this painting, which was resolved only recently, in the summer of 2025. For a long time, art historians considered another painting, Fisherman at Sea, to be Turner's first exhibited oil work. We'll talk about it a bit later. The thing is, Approaching Squall disappeared from researchers' view after a private collector bought it in 1858 and took it to Australia. So far from Europe, there were few art experts. The painting often changed hands, and at some point its documentation was lost. During this time, it became covered with a thick layer of old yellowed varnish, household dust, and soot from fireplaces or candles, which hid Turner's signature in the corner. Some dealer looked at it and decided that it was the work of Julius Caesar Ibbotson. So it hung there, dirty, dark, and dusty, on the walls of various houses for almost 160 years. The painting surfaced at a small provincial auction in England. Because it was dirty and listed as the work of an unknown follower of Ibbotson, it was valued at only £600, but it didn't even reach that mark. One collector took a chance and bought it for just £500 sterling. He was the one who sent it for cleaning, during which restorers discovered Turner's hidden signature. Experts from Sotheby's auction house and leading art historians worldwide confirmed its authenticity, restoring the painting's status as the very first and most ambitious debut of the young genius in oil painting. Once real research started, bidding and offers soared immediately. The status of being Turner's very first oil painting, and you'll soon find out just how great this boy from the slums became, caused a huge stir among collectors. In the end, the painting was sold for an insane amount, almost $2.5 million. It was purchased by a private British collector. And this is yet another story for our collection that explains why art is so expensive these days. No one noticed the painting for 160 years, and no one considered it a masterpiece until a name appeared on it. And immediately its value skyrocketed by 4,000 times. No one cares about beauty and skill anymore. Most art experts simply can't even see them until a famous name appears. And that's exactly why paintings like these are worth millions. They were signed by someone famous. Unfortunately, beauty has become secondary, just like the ability of many art experts to understand it. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you really want to understand art. This painting was his first attempt at the skill that would become his calling card. Some critics even recognized it as a noble attempt to elevate landscape art from bland tastelessness to something much more significant. Remember that landscapes were considered a secondary art form, incapable of evoking emotions as strong as scenes with people. And let's watch how Turner will change this attitude. Your attitude will change too. At the age of 21, he exhibited an oil painting at the Academy exhibition for the first time. It was that very painting, Fisherman at Sea, which for a long time was considered his first. It depicted a moonlit night over the English Channel. No grand historical scenes, no allegories, just small boats in the night sea and the moon breaking through the clouds. And look, here he is, just like Ivazovsky 40 years later, trying to capture the transparency of the waves, the moonlight shining through the water. It's an extremely difficult skill, and we can see that he's not doing very well at it. But that's not the main point. This painting already shows what will become his signature style. Light and the elements are the main characters in his paintings, while people are minor, secondary figures, helplessly retreating in the face of nature's fury. The painting caused a sensation. The young artist, who had previously been known only for his watercolors, suddenly revealed a brilliant talent for oil landscape painting. The influential newspaper The Companion wrote, "We do not hesitate to state that this painting is one of the most striking achievements of the current exhibition. This young man will become an outstanding master of his craft." Major General John Stewart, a prominent collector, bought the painting directly from the exhibition. Sorry, the sale price information wasn't preserved, so I can't provide it. Turner, who was practically born in the marketplace, was a very clever fellow. He understood that his lowly origins would always stand in the way of his advancement. Therefore, he chose to minimize risks and at first painted only large canvases in the style of the classical masters that were highly approved by the Academy, so that the Academy would be convinced of his skill and loyalty. This was a very sensible and pragmatic approach. First, make a name for yourself, and only then allow yourself some liberties. Turner's classical paintings and watercolors were in great demand at exhibitions. He very quickly became the best-selling student, and this directly affected the Academy's financial situation. Remember, I said that the Academy earned mainly from sales at exhibitions, so by the time he was 26, Turner had become a gold mine for the Academy. In the history of the Royal Academy of Arts, before Turner, there simply hadn't been any students who so rapidly turned their academy into such a powerful commercial machine. By the age of 26, Turner was not just a well-off young man, but a wealthy one. While other graduates spent years searching for wealthy patrons and scraping by with odd jobs. Soon, in 1804, Turner would be able to afford something that almost no other artist in London, not even the most renowned, could do. He would open his own private gallery on Harley Street to sell his paintings directly, bypassing middlemen. It would be managed by his proud father. The artist inherited his father's hard-nosed business sense, never gave discounts, demanded advance payment, meticulously calculated the cost of frames and materials, and knew how to squeeze the maximum out of every deal. Academician Johann Heinrich Füssli once sarcastically remarked that Turner was making money hand over fist. Thus, by the age of 26, Turner had proven to the Academy that landscape painting, still considered a secondary genre, could be extremely profitable. He became the most commercially successful young artist in British history. Soon, Turner exhibited another important painting, Dutch Boats in a Gale, at the Royal Academy exhibition, and it was placed in the best spot, in the main hall, right in the center, directly opposite the entrance. And there's another interesting story connected to this painting. I hope you're not tired of them yet. It was bought even before it was exhibited. The thing is, it was commissioned directly from Turner by none other than Francis Egerton, the third Duke of Bridgewater, an avid collector and coal magnate. He already had in his collection a painting by the famous 17th century Dutch marine artist Willem van de Velde the Younger, called Ships in a Stormy Sea. The Dutch were considered unrivaled masters of seascape painting at that time. The Duke decided to conduct an experiment and commissioned a promising 25-year-old Turner to create a companion painting. Such paintings are called pendants, which was to hang in his luxurious mansion directly opposite the Van de Velde painting. For Turner, this was a bold challenge to prove that his art was in no way inferior to the recognized classics, but just think about it. What must that have felt like? At the age of 25, the highest aristocrats in the country already considered him worthy of taking on Dutch painting. For the Dutch Boats in a Gale, the Duke paid Turner £250 sterling. A doctor or a successful lawyer would earn that amount in a year. For the young artist, it was a colossal sum and the largest fee for an oil painting he had received up to that point in his life. When the painting was finished, it was exhibited at the Academy. It caused an absolute sensation. Critics believed that Turner had outdone the Dutch master at his own game. They wrote that his sea was more furious, the clouds more menacing, and the boats were just seconds away from colliding, creating incredible tension. The confrontation with the Dutch itself became a great PR move. There were always crowds of people around the canvas. British critics were raving with excitement, and for Turner, this success became the final chord that guaranteed him a place as an academician the following year. There were only 40 academicians, no more, no less. It was an elite, closed, lifelong club that you could only join if a spot opened up, and that was only possible after the death of one of the 40. Because of this restriction, there was fierce behind-the-scenes competition within the Academy. You could be a genius, your paintings could sell for huge amounts of money, but if all 40 seats were occupied by living people, all you could do was wait. When one of the 40 academicians died, the Academy Council would announce a competition for the vacant seat. Only active full academicians were allowed to vote. And you remember that Turner was of low birth, with rough manners and the speech of a commoner, and some influential members of the council were against his candidacy. But a couple of years ago, Turner was put on the official waiting list for his services to the Academy, and he had no choice but to enter the competition. Thus, by the way, the timely success of the ships in the stormy sea at the exhibition and the fabulous fee led to the fact that out of several candidates for the recently vacated position, the overwhelming majority voted for Turner. At the age of 27, Turner became the youngest academician in the history of this institution. And in 1802, Turner traveled to the continent for the first time, visiting Paris and Switzerland. This became possible thanks to the Peace of Amiens, a brief truce between Britain and France, which gave tourists a few months to cross the English Channel. He immediately rushed to the Louvre, where he spent weeks studying the old masters, Rubens, Titian, Poussin, making sketches, comparing and analyzing. But the Alps made the strongest impression on him. Turner had never seen real mountains before, huge ones, looming over the landscape with their massive presence. Mountain passes, glaciers, clouds below the horizon, all of this completely changed his sense of scale and gave him a whole new perspective on the power and grandeur of nature, its immensity. He had already tried out his technical approach in watercolors, not restricting objects with sharp lines. All that was left was to not be afraid to reflect this in his paintings. But classicism dictated that man should be put first and glorified, and nature was just there as a backdrop. Meanwhile, Turner's recognition was growing. In 1804, as I already mentioned, he opened his own gallery in a house on Harley Street, which he rented. He was earning well, but he was reluctant to sell. Parting with his paintings was almost physically difficult for him, and here it's important to mention a very significant detail that will shed light on the artist's entire subsequent life and actions. Even then, he began to realize the scale of his own genius, and seeing what had happened to the collections of the geniuses of the past, he set himself the goal of making sure that his paintings would not be scattered. Even then, he planned to concentrate all his most important masterpieces together, and later to donate them to England with the strict condition that they all be exhibited for free and in one place. His plans would only be partially fulfilled because of greedy relatives. I'll talk about that at the end. But it's important for us to remember that Turner was not a modest man. He clearly understood that he would become one of the most important artists in Great Britain. And from a very early age, he began to lay the groundwork for his historical legacy. He collected his most successful masterpieces, was reluctant to sell them, and when he became wealthy, he started buying back his best works. In 1807, he was appointed professor of perspective at the Academy, a position he would hold for 20 years, periodically giving lectures and then cancelling them, leaving his colleagues puzzled by his inconsistency. Students constantly complained that his pronunciation was so unclear that it was difficult for them to understand his lectures. Most artists of that time, once they became academicians, tried to live up to their high rank, hiring speech tutors, etiquette and dress tutors, and buying good houses. Turner, although he was not the first commoner to become an academician, was the first who made no attempt whatsoever to change himself to please high society. He was so confident in his talent that he actually enjoyed irritating his refined colleagues. A combination of social and financial independence created the perfect conditions for Turner to stop pretending to be an ideal follower of classicism and to start experimenting. He was already a lifelong academician with more money than he could spend, so he didn't care what the Academy Council snobs said. We have already seen this mechanism many times in the biographies of artists, when the true flourishing of an artist's talent comes only after he gains financial freedom. It was the same with Claude Monet, Paul Cézanne, and Edgar Degas. And in 1812, at the age of 37, he exhibited a painting at the Academy exhibition that changed everything, both for him and for British painting as a whole. This is going to be very interesting too. Snowstorm Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. 1.5 by 2.5 meters. Let's take a close look at it. Instead of the usual classical landscape with a clear structure and composition, with human figures in the foreground, we see a completely different main character, a whirlwind. A huge oval whirlpool of clouds, snow, and darkness occupies almost the entire canvas. And only somewhere in the depths are tiny figures of soldiers hemmed in by the mountains. Hannibal is somewhere there, but you won't find his heroic figure on a rearing horse. You can barely find him at all. Nature in this painting visually engulfs people, making them seem so small and insignificant before its fury. The title of the painting in those days dictated a mise-en-scène with people and Hannibal in the foreground, overcoming the storm with superhuman effort. But here everything is turned upside down. How did he even come up with this idea? In 1810, he was staying in Yorkshire with his close friend and patron, Walter Fox, at the Farnley Hall estate. One evening, a severe snowstorm broke out. While everyone was hiding in the house, Turner ran outside, fascinated by the scale of the chaos, and began sketching the wind and clouds right in his notebook. It was a great coincidence. The Yorkshire sky became the model for the sky over the ancient Alps, which had impressed him so much in Europe, and he decided to combine these two natural giants, the mountains and the snowstorm, and place tiny people in the painting only to emphasize the scale of the elements. Like we take our photos from a distance to show the dizzying height or the gigantic size of the building behind us. There's a political context too. Just 2 years before that, Jacques-Louis David painted his famous masterpiece, Napoleon Crossing the St. Bernard Pass. You've probably seen it many times. And here we see perfect classicism, the glorification of man, his dominance over nature, a heroic face, and a clear horizon. As you remember, England and France have always competed and been at odds with each other. And the year 1812 was the peak of Napoleon's power, when he decided to embark on his fateful campaign against Russia. And Turner's painting turned everything upside down, demonstrating the insignificance of man, practically belittling him in the face of nature. This whirlwind is depicted so impressively that it's as if we're looking at a real hurricane, feeling the movement of light, sensing the dynamics of the fierce wind currents. No one had painted like that before him, and it was a huge risk to put a natural phenomenon at the center of the story. The painting caused a sensation. Viewers at the Academy stood frozen before it in shock. Never before had the sea or sky looked so aggressive and three-dimensional. To enhance the impression, Turner insisted that a poem from his own work, The Deceptiveness of Hope, be printed next to the painting's title in the exhibition catalogue. The poem spoke about how, after the fleeting triumph of a commander, the inevitable end brought by the elements and time always follows. And this added even more drama. I told you he was a great businessman. His technique changed drastically. Turner here does indeed abandon clear lines. He applied paint with a palette knife, smeared it with his fingers and rags in circular motions, creating the sensation of tangible wet snow flying straight at the viewer's face. From this moment on, the very Turner appears, the one whose paintings I first saw at the Tate Museum in London, and I couldn't wait to tell you about them. The war with Napoleon ended in 1815. Europe opened up, and in 1819, at the age of 44, Turner traveled to Italy for the first time. This journey finally shaped Turner's mature style. Not because he suddenly discovered something fundamentally new in technique, his mastery was already exceptional, but because the Italian light and color did to him what the northern fog could not. They finally convinced him that the main subject of painting is not the object itself, but how light depicts it. Before that, he had been to France and Switzerland, but he had never been to southern countries with their color, sea, and sun. Imagine what an impression Italy made on him. Turner traveled through Turin, Milan, Como, Venice, Florence, Rome, and Naples. In only a few months, he created over 1,500 sketches. Venice captivated him. The lagoon, palaces reflected in water, soft light over the sea, and beaches divided by canals. He would return there twice more and paint dozens of Venetian paintings. They would become some of his most beloved works among the public. So what exactly changed in his painting after Italy? Look at Turner's early works, for example, Fishermen at Sea. Everything is clear. Here are the boats, here is the sea, here is the sky, here is the moon. Each object has clear boundaries and its own place in the composition. And now look at the Italian works from the 1820s, Sunset over the Sea or Venice from the Ponte della Paglia. Objects begin to melt, their outlines become blurred. Color and brushstroke direction take on more and more of the work of defining the boundaries of objects. The sky and water finally stop being just a background. They become the main characters. Technically, this was expressed in several ways. Turner switched to white primed canvases. Unlike the traditional dark ones, this gave an inner glow that couldn't be achieved on a brown base. He also began using new pigments, chrome yellow, chrome orange, and cobalt blue. These paints only appeared at the beginning of the 19th century thanks to the development of the chemical industry as a result of the Industrial Revolution. They were brighter and more saturated than anything that had been available before, and also much cheaper, which, as you can imagine, was very important to the practical Turner. And Turner, unlike many of his colleagues, who at first considered the new colors to be fake and too flashy, was not afraid to use them in unusual ways, immediately standing out among his peers. But at the same time, his paintings also became unnatural. He completely stopped painting from nature, recreating his landscapes from memory, having gained experience and rather inventing all these crazy whirlwinds. His paintings became, in a way, a projection of his imagination, his ideas about the elements, and therefore became the earliest precursors of Expressionism, which Van Gogh would pick up 50 years later. A style in which the emotions and fantasies of the artist are the main theme of his paintings. Some academics began to call him and his followers white painters, mockingly referring to the overly light and overly bright, unnatural tones. Sir George Beaumont, an influential patron of the arts and a painter himself, loudly called Turner's paintings blotches. Newspapers wrote that Turner smeared his canvases with soap foam and egg yolk and that he had lost his mind, and soon Turner's greedy relatives would use these words against him. But Turner was already earning enough and had such authority that he didn't really care. Despite all this criticism, by the 1830s, Turner was rich and famous. He was an extremely enterprising fellow and understood that his new experimental art wouldn't be bought right now. And for his wealthy clients, he painted quite classical canvases, landscapes, views of Italian ruins, English castles, and classic seascapes. But most of his money came from prints. They were inexpensive, but sold in huge numbers all over Europe, bringing him a solid passive income, which allowed him not to worry too much about negative criticism. He was sure that it was this new technique, these blurred semi-abstractions, that would secure his legacy forever. Therefore, he viewed attacks and criticism with indifferent superiority. Moreover, in England, a class of super-rich industrialists was just beginning to form, and they adored Turner precisely for his radicalism and boldness. They bought his paintings right at the auction. By that time, his paintings sometimes sold for 1,000 or even 1,500 pounds sterling, which is about £1,000,000 in today's money. And if there was a risk that a painting would go for too little, Turner would buy it himself to keep his reputation and prices high. Many of the most radical, almost abstract paintings that amaze us today in modern museums were never exhibited by Turner during his lifetime, and he didn't even try to sell them. In his secret studio, he painted pure light, air, and color, things that Victorian England simply couldn't stomach. He hid these canvases from prying eyes, gathering them for his most important collection, his posthumous one. In general, Turner was far from being a starving, misunderstood artist. He was a very tough, stingy, and calculating London businessman. He made a huge fortune from art and engravings that the public could understand. And it was this wealth that served as his shield, allowing him in his later years to ignore public opinion and create a revolutionary style that critics would tear apart, but which would ultimately change the history of world painting forever. And now let's focus on that very painting, which in 2005 was named the best British painting of all time in a National Gallery poll in England. This is the last voyage of the ship Valiant, 1838. Here, I need to explain the context. Valiant is a sailing ship of the line, one of the heroes of the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where Nelson defeated the Franco-Spanish fleet. The ship is a symbol, a legendary ship. However, in 1838, it was sold for scrap because steamships, which appeared as a result of the Industrial Revolution, were already replacing sailing ships. Turner personally saw how a small, unremarkable steam tug was pulling the huge white hull of the noble Valiant up the Thames toward oblivion. Look at the painting. On the left, the ghostly white silhouette of the Valiant is huge, monumental, almost bodiless. On the right, there's a small black steamship with smoke pouring from its funnel, and on the horizon, a dazzling sunset, orange and gold. There are two celestial bodies at once, the moon on the right, the sun on the left. A very symbolic, though extremely rare phenomenon. But Turner was after feeling, not accuracy. The old grandeur is fading, the new mechanical world is triumphant. And all of this is in a stream of incredible light, much closer and almost embracing the submissive Leviathan who once shook the world with its might. An incredibly beautiful allegory, isn't it, my friends? When the painting was exhibited at the Academy, it became a sensation. The poet Thackeray wrote, "This is the most magnificent thing among all that was exhibited this year, and I think of everything this man has ever painted." Turner, of course, refused to sell it. Even when 10 years later, a wealthy collector offered him an absolutely fantastic sum of £5,000 for the painting, Turner refused. Then the buyer suggested that Turner name his own price. There is a legend now that he wrote him a blank check, but that's not entirely true. Turner refused again. By that time, he would already be 73 years old, and he would have already finalized his famous bequest to England, and the Fighting Temeraire would be the jewel of a grand gift, which we'll talk about a bit later. He was already old and fabulously wealthy, and to combine his true legacy would have been extremely short-sighted. I think any of you in his place would have done the same. Write in the comments what you would do. I'm very curious. But what irony, my friends. 10 years later, people were willing to pay £5,000 for a memory of the ship that had been sold for scrap, for whose demise the same £5,000 had once been paid. But let's go back a bit. When Turner was being criticized by all the academic circles for his new style, which many called a salad, and the artist was showered with ridicule and accusations of madness. In 1940, the young critic John Ruskin began his monumental work, Modern Painters. This book would become the most influential art book of the 19th century, completely transforming Victorian culture and forever changing the way humanity looks at painting and nature. Initially, Ruskin took up the pen with one specific and passionate goal: to defend William Turner from the critics. He dedicated the entire first volume to Turner and utterly demolished the attacks. In the book, he argued that Turner was not insane, but rather the greatest artist in history, and that he was the only one who depicted nature not by dry academic rules, but in all its living, changing, and profound truth. Not a frozen puppet like landscape, but the real dynamics of ever changing nature. John Ruskin created a cult of Turner that still exists today, becoming the artist's main advocate in his time. And in 1842, Turner travels to Italy again, and in Rome, he meets another great marine painter of the 19th century, Ivan Ivazovsky. Turner was 67 years old, and Ivazovsky was 25. Ivazovsky was in Rome as part of his overseas assignment from the St. Petersburg Academy. His paintings Neapolitan Night, The Storm, and The Chaos of Creation had just caused a sensation at the Grand Roman Exhibition. Everyone was talking about them. Pope Gregory XVI himself wanted to buy The Chaos for the Vatican, but Ivazovsky simply gifted the painting to the pontiff, understanding that having his painting in the Vatican was worth more than any amount of money. Watch more about this in the video about Ivazovsky. I'll leave the link in the description. Turner visited Ivazovsky's exhibition, which all the newspapers were buzzing about, and was impressed by the painting Bay of Naples on a moonlit night. Turner, who himself spent his whole life searching for the secret of depicting pure light and air, was absolutely amazed by how the young man conveyed the moonlight shining on the water and the gentle night mist. The recognized master of marine painting, the eminent academician, didn't just pay tribute in words, he did something that no one expected from him, an old man who was reserved and sparing with praise. He wrote a poem in honor of Ivazovsky in Italian. I'll read it to you now in a free translation. In your painting, I see the moon with its gold and silver, standing above the sea, and within it, the sea. Forgive me, great artist, if I was mistaken in taking your painting for reality. But your work enchanted me, and I was overcome with admiration. Your art is lofty and powerful because you were inspired by genius. For Ivazovsky, praise from Turner himself became a powerful boost for his career and creativity. He proudly recalled this Roman episode for the rest of his life. They both went down in history as the leading romantics of the sea, but look at how different they are. If Ivazovsky paints the sea pedantically, precisely, and with incredible realism, fantastically conveying the light shining through the waves, then Turner brings the ocean to life. With broad, sweeping brushstrokes, he creates his famous swirls, producing a truly mesmerizing sense of movement. These two great marine painters achieved that effect in completely different ways, although both placed light at the center of their work. Let's take a look at their differences, which I'm sure are already obvious to you, but it's so interesting to see how differently the same subject can be painted. Let's start with the method. Turner made thousands of sketches outdoors and then worked on his paintings in the studio for a long time, sometimes for years. Ivazovsky also painted from memory and was proud of it, but he painted very quickly, a week for a large canvas. His memory worked differently. He could reproduce a scene with almost photographic accuracy, maintaining documentary authenticity. Turner used memory for transformation. He turned what he saw into a memory. Grand, sometimes completely incomprehensible, but no less impressive because of it. If Ivazovsky amazes us with photographic accuracy, for Turner, accuracy doesn't matter at all. He wanted to evoke emotion decades before Impressionism appeared. Let's talk about light. Both artists called light the main character of their paintings, but Ivazovsky's light is a specific recognizable Black Sea or Mediterranean light, warm, golden, with transparent waves through which it shines. Turner's light is almost an abstraction that seems to live its own life. It's the pure fantasy of the artist, sometimes much more fierce than any force of nature that exists on Earth. His light absorbs form, dissolves objects within itself, and turns into pure madness. Now, about the purpose. Ivazovsky wanted the viewer to feel as if they were standing on the seashore. He conveyed nature so accurately and vividly that the viewer couldn't distinguish the painting from reality, and we really see that. Turner, on the other hand, wanted the viewer to feel something for which there is no exact word, horror and beauty at the same time, the majesty of nature before which a person is nothing. Ivazovsky was 42 years younger and would outlive Turner by half a century. His style would remain recognizable, complete, and academically impeccable until the very end. By the end of his life, Turner went places few of his contemporaries dared to go. Write in the comments who you like more. Let's discuss. Turner's paintings are so captivating that they inevitably became surrounded by legends. The most famous myth about Turner is the story of how he ordered sailors to tie him to the mast of a ship during a real storm so he could paint his famous work Snowstorm, Steamboat off a harbor's mouth. I think it became so famous precisely because of that story. Legend has it that Turner spent 4 hours tied to the mast and nearly died. Look at this painting. It's almost pure abstraction, but you have to admit, it evokes much more emotion than any modern one. You know, friends, I sometimes ask myself, what if art had followed the path of Turner and Kandinsky without falling into complete non objectivity and abstraction, and had kept recognizable outlines and forms on the canvas? Then I think art would be much closer, more understandable, and more emotional, and that's exactly what real art should be. A set of circles and squares, no matter how harmoniously they are arranged, cannot evoke any feelings in the viewer stronger than curiosity. And take a look at the world's first abstractions by Turner. You want to lose yourself in them, even though the difference between this and that is simply the presence of a story, either told by the artist or imagined by the viewer. But I got sidetracked, sorry. Let's get back to our legend. Turner himself told the story like this: I asked the sailors to tie me to the mast so I could watch what was happening. I didn't expect to survive, but I felt that I had to capture it if I did. It sounds, you have to admit, extremely emotional, but not very convincing. To die and never paint the picture? Let's figure this out. First of all, Turner was already 67 years old in 1842, and his health was far from excellent. Tying a man almost 70 years old to a mast is some kind of outrageous sadism. Secondly, none of the documented sources, ship logs, records, or eyewitness accounts confirm this story aside from the artist himself. Thirdly, the painting was created so expressively and from memory that it doesn't look at all like a work done from life. Most likely, Turner really was on a ship during a storm. This fits his character and habits quite well, but being tied to the mast is doubtful. Most likely, it's a deliberate artistic exaggeration meant to create an aura of authenticity, suggesting that the artist saw this with his own eyes, staring death in the face. When the snowstorm appeared at the exhibition, one critic wrote in the newspaper that it was just soap suds and whitewash. Hinting precisely at the unnaturalness of the painting, Turner was furious because he considered this painting one of his most honest works. And when Ruskin came to his house, Turner, deeply offended, told him the story about tying himself to the mast, apparently making it up as a counter-argument to the accusation of unnaturalness. In the end, Ruskin stood up for the artist, saying, "This is one of the greatest statements about the sea, about fog and light that has ever been put on canvas." One way or another, Snowstorm is the first painting in which the last hint of classical structure disappears, a painting separated from complete abstraction only by the barely discernible figure of a steamship. Remove it, and only chaos remains. And this is 1842, 30 years before the Impressionists and 80 years before Kandinsky. Before we move on to Turner's later period, I'll tell you a bit about what was happening in Britain in the 1840s, so you can understand the world the artist was working in. The Industrial Revolution changed the country beyond recognition, and the railways disrupted the established rhythm of life. The train from London to Birmingham, 200 kilometers away, now takes 2 hours instead of 2 days. Steamships were replacing sailing ships, manual labor was being replaced by steam engines, and everything was changing at a dizzying speed. Turner was no longer a young man, and of course, he didn't like all this headlong progress. As we've already seen from the painting The Fighting Temeraire, even in this alien chaos, he still tried to draw inspiration. And in 1844, he painted Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway. Look at this painting. It seems even bolder than the snowstorm. The locomotive speeds over the viaduct above the river, but where are the viaduct, river, and sky? Everything is barely visible. In the swirl of layered paints, everything is dissolved in a golden gray haze, from which the dark silhouette of the locomotive emerges and nothing else. Critics were once again divided. Some saw meaningless chaos, others saw a revolution. Today we know that both sides were right. It was a revolution that seemed like chaos to its contemporaries. But Turner didn't care. He was getting older and becoming more withdrawn and eccentric. He began to hide from people and admirers, realizing that he didn't have much time left, and devoted himself completely to preserving his legacy. His father, who once helped at the gallery, had died long ago, and the gallery fell into neglect. And he was never married. His two daughters, Evelina and Georgiana, were born to Sarah Danby, the widow of a London composer. He supported them financially and acknowledged them, but never officially claimed to be their father. Around 1827, Sophia Booth, a widow from Margate, appeared in his life, with whom he secretly lived in a secluded house in Chelsea. Just like with his paintings, Turner led a double life in his personal affairs. For clients and academics, he had an official, pompous house, and for his personal life, a secret one that no one knew about at all. He was terrified that people would find out how wealthy he really was and would start trying to swindle him out of his money or rob him. By hiding his addresses, the old miser made life difficult both for the tax authorities, from whom he concealed his income, and for countless petitioners. He became so obsessed with secrecy that even his housekeeper, Hannah Denby, who managed his official London house, didn't know for years exactly where he was going. Her master would spend weeks and even months in his secret house in Stearns, introducing himself to neighbors as Mr. Budd, hiding his true identity, and no one even suspected that they were in the presence of England's greatest painter. And here, his preserved commoner's accent came in very handy, allowing him to blend in among ordinary workers. Let me tell you a story that really highlights Turner's character. In 1841, England conducted its first ever modern and very thorough national census. Homeowners were required to write down the names of everyone who spent the night in their house on the night of June 6th to 7th. Turner, who at that time was secretly living in two houses, used pseudonyms and hid his income, was horrified that officials would record his exact address and reveal his secrets. According to the legend, which in fact was told by Turner himself, as you can imagine, he liked to create a bit of mystery. On that fateful night, when the government tried to pry into his personal information, he got into a boat and spent the night in the middle of the Thames with lighthouses, thus deceiving the meticulous officials. But in reality, according to the official census documents, it only got worse, because his housekeeper at his official residence honestly entered the artist into the census. And then, Sophia Booth, with whom he lived in his secret hideout in Chelsea, also entered him into the records. And it turned out that at that time, there were two William Turners in London. And that's a perfect touch to his character. A man who managed huge fortunes, mingled with lords, and painted timeless masterpieces was most afraid that some London clerk would put a check mark next to his real last name. In the last decades of his life, Turner became increasingly reclusive. His health rapidly declined, and he grew gloomier and more pessimistic. Since 1846, Turner rarely left his secret hideaway in Chelsea. By the late 1840s, Turner was nearly blind, suffering from depression and physical exhaustion, but even when he could no longer paint with oils, he continued to make sketches. In his last days, Sophia Booth took care of him, literally feeding him spoonfuls of milk mixed with brandy. William Turner passed away on December 19, 1851 in Chelsea at the age of 76. The secret of his hideout was uncovered by lawyers only a day before the artist's death. Just a day before his death, his lawyer was finally able to figure out the address from an old letter accidentally found in his pocket and arrived in Chelsea, finding the artist already on his deathbed. Turner was buried with the highest honors in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, next to Sir Joshua Reynolds, just as he had wished, the man who had admitted him to the Academy almost 60 years earlier. Now we move on to the next part, the story of his will, as I promised to share. For 20 years, Turner repeatedly rewrote his will, trying to protect his paintings from being sold into private hands and divided among his heirs. He left a colossal fortune of £150,000 sterling, which is about $200 million in today's money, and he bequeathed all his works to the British nation. But what happened after his death turned into one of the most high-profile court cases in Victorian England. As soon as Turner died, his distant cousins and relatives, whom he had deliberately excluded from his will, filed a lawsuit. The coordinator of the lawsuit was the son of one of his cousins, J.M.W. The relatives claimed that Turner was not in his right mind when he wrote the will. As evidence, they cited his eccentric lifestyle under a false name, newspaper criticism accusing him of madness, and his later, almost abstract paintings, which ordinary people, and apparently his not-so-bright relatives, considered the work of a madman. They also claimed that his noble plans, Turner bequeathed a large sum for the creation of a retirement home for poor and destitute male artists, violated British laws regarding perpetual land donations. After 5 years of difficult legal proceedings, in March 1856, the Court of Chancery issued a compromise decision. The relatives received all the cash, real estate, and material assets of the artist. Because of this, Turner's wonderful idea of creating a charitable foundation for needy artists was unfortunately buried forever. The court ruled, however, that all of Turner's artworks that were in his studio at the time of his death would unconditionally become the property of the British people. The relatives did not receive them. When the experts entered Turner's abandoned house, they were shocked. The paintings were kept in terrible conditions. The canvases were cracked from dampness, covered in dirt and bird droppings. John Ruskin himself, the main defender of Turner during his lifetime, voluntarily took on the titanic task of sorting out this chaos. He spent years cataloging and saving the master's drawings. The gift to the nation, now known as the Turner Bequest, turned out to be the largest in the history of Great Britain. About 300 oil paintings, including around 100 finished masterpieces and up to 200 unfinished works. More than 30,000 drawings, watercolors, and sketches, including 300 travel sketchbooks. Turner stipulated in his will that a separate building be built for his paintings, but the government refused to fund it, so his legacy is now split into three parts. The Tate Britain Gallery in London, the National Gallery in London, and another part, the only one kept as the artist himself wanted. In his first will, Turner set a strict condition. His two paintings, Dido, the founder of Carthage, and Languid Dawn, must always hang in the National Gallery, directly next to the works of the 17th century French master Claude Lorraine. Turner wanted to prove to future generations that the British school of painting was in no way inferior to the old European masters. This condition is still strictly observed by the museum to this day. Turner's late, hidden works, which he did not show to the public and which were revealed to the nation only after a court case, were half a century ahead of their time. When they were finally taken out of storage and exhibited publicly, the world was astonished. Turner was officially recognized as a forerunner of modernism. His dissolution of form into pure light and color inspired the French Impressionists Claude Monet and Camille Pissarro, who specifically studied his works in London, and later the abstract artists of the 20th century. Today, the most prestigious and talked about award in the field of contemporary art in Great Britain bears his name, the Turner Prize, established in 1984. The cunning, secretive, and eccentric Londoner fully achieved his goal. He secured for himself absolute, undeniable immortality. Friends, I created this channel to tell you about art in a simple and engaging way. I love doing this. And every new video is my little project for which I need to build an interesting narrative, select up to 500 photos, arrange them correctly, and caption them. It's a huge amount of work, but quality is more important to me than quantity. I'll keep doing this, but your support would be really helpful to me. Please become a sponsor of the channel here on YouTube, or even get the smallest subscription on Boosty or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. Let's create the most knowledgeable art community in the world. And thank you for watching.